Greg Elitch. The topic of tonight's talk is the empire under attack, from Latin America to Occupy Wall Street. For decades, U.S. power has blocked social change in Latin America. Now, democratic forces are fighting back. With Occupy Wall Street, the fight for real democracy has spread to the heart of empire. Our speaker tonight is an internationally known author of 24 books, including Democracy for the Few, God and His Demons, and The Face of Democracy. His book, Face of Imperialism, that's right, thank you. His book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. His latest book is The Face of Imperialism, which you can find on the back table there. And I highly recommend this book. It's one of his best. It's well worth reading. Desmond's going to have a copy now. Cornel West describes the speaker as a towering prophetic voice in American life. Alternative Radio says he is one of this country's foremost independent political analysts. And the A-Info's radio project calls him America's preeminent political analyst. Please welcome Dr. Michael Parenti.
Great. And for those of you who don't know, Greg Elitch is a political writer and author who has produced some very worthwhile works also. Who was it who called me the most preeminent?
A-Info's radio project. It's the A-Info alternative.
It's a precision derivative.
Oh, I see. Well, that's nice. I hadn't known that. I like that Cornel West. I always had to laugh. He called me a towering figure. He's about a foot taller than I am. Parenti, you're a towering figure. Okay, well, anyway, I'm not really going to talk about what's in the title of the talk that much. I want to really talk about some basics, some very fundamental things. They're so simple and they're so basic, and in fact, most of the people who address U.S. foreign policy do not accept them or do not even show awareness. In other words, I want to talk about what empire really is. Why does it happen? The primary function of empire, the prime imperative behind the drive for expansion is, and this is my thesis, and this is what I'll argue tonight, is the acquisition of wealth. That's what it's about. Who benefits, who pays? That's what I want to discuss. Who motivates, or what motivates the creation and expansion of empire? What are the deceptive methods used by imperialism's purveyors? The real story really is very much at variance with what we're taught by pundits and publicists and professors and politicians and policymakers. From Ecuador to the Philippines to Nicaragua, to Nigeria, government agents, gendarmerie, and courts encouraged indigenous peoples to move from resource-rich lands into missionary reservations or shanty towns where they would receive a dole of some sort, or they're just coerced and pushed out because they don't have any paper to show that they really own the land, because their ancestors have occupied this land for like 300 years. So, 300 years ago they didn't have court papers. Sometimes the encouragement to get people off lands involves bully clubs, assassinations, firebombings of homes, and numerous other acts of terror. Workers are recruited at subsistence wages, and they will toil in serious risk and injury conditions for really starvation subsistence wages because they have no other source of income, because jobs are almost non-existent. Frequently slavery, historically slavery, was and still is a mode of value extraction and accumulation. There are today millions of people who are being trafficked in work slavery and sex slavery in almost every part of the world, including Europe and the United States. because it's so profitable for the traffickers. Another thing that corporations do, and what corporations do is the basis of what empires do. Corporations may go into impoverished areas that have little or no resource wealth. And they do it just to exploit the available cheap labor in those areas. For instance, instead of paying workers in Ohio $20 an hour plus benefits, the factory moves to some poor part of Alabama. When the workers in Alabama begin to organize and start agitating and resisting the exploitative ways, the factory moves to Mexico. When the Mexican workers begin to organize, as they've done a number of times, the factory moves to Indonesia. All the way to Indonesia, Nike has done that. Now, there's nothing in Indonesia for Nike shoes. They bring all the materials, all the technology, all the machinery, everything. It's called outsourcing. Because, and it's profitable. They can go through this expense of moving all of this stuff halfway around the world, because instead of paying $20 an hour, they pay 12 cents an hour. You know, we think about, we Americans would never work. Who here would work for 12 cents an hour? Don't think, why is that? Why are they willing to work? Is they have less self-respect than we do, or what? It's because our labor conditions are at a level or a stage of historical development that we don't have to work for 12 cents an hour. We used to work for 12. Your great-grandparents used to work. My grandparents, my grandpa, building the subway, made $2 a day in the New York subway. He had come from Italy in 1904. Another grandfather of mine came from 1887 from Italy. You're allowed 2 grandfathers, everybody is. And again, worked as a tinkerer and such for subsistence, for coins. That was the condition of labor, and that's the condition of labor ruling groups are trying to get us back to right now, today. So the struggle, the imperial struggle, is also a domestic struggle. It gets replicated, much of the same thing. You know, you can starve out workers in Alabama, you can starve them out in Indonesia. So Nike goes to Indonesia, which is a nice little fascist state, you know, where there isn't much way of resisting or organizing and such. And it does it not to give us a break. Those shoes still cost an awful lot. They don't go all the way over there to give you a break and give you dirt cheap shoes. No, you still got to pay $200, $300 for some of these shoes or more. And that's because the whole move is to increase the margin of value that's expropriated, that's accumulated. And that's done by suppressing labor. The whole process is called outsourcing. That's what the corporations call it. They've got a whole bunch of nice words for the terrible things they do. There's something else that empires do, and that's environmental destruction. Mining companies, to take one example, don't venture into Montana or Chile or West Virginia or Bolivia or Canada or the Congo or wherever in order to advance the quality of life for local populations. Corporations are not mining the land or drilling for oil or cutting down rainforests or fracking the underground water streams with an eye to preserving the natural beauty and health of the environment, that's for sure. Abundant communal lands are turned into toxic wastelands, and what the corporations do, as you know, they foist their diseconomies onto the public realm. It's sort of like the very environment itself is treated like a global trash can. The resources of the environment are treated as limitless, and the effusions of the production process are treated as something you can just throw out back into that environment. I also argue that in the realm of the empire, there's no such thing as underdevelopment, or very little underdevelopment, really. That some centuries ago, most of the third world was not desperately impoverished and was not desperately dislocated. Poverty was not the original and natural condition of people. People lived modestly, but with sufficiency, often amidst an abundance of game, fresh water, and plant foods. By now, however, many areas of the world have been ravaged. Self-sufficient populations are reduced to devastation, utmost poverty, and they pile into the shanty towns of metropolises. Well, in other words, wealth creates poverty. We always think of wealth and poverty as an unfortunate juxtaposition. We say, so much poverty right here and so much wealth right here. Go look at an aerial shot of Rio, and you'll see these rich hotels right here, and right behind them, a great mass of shanty towns where people are living really right at the very hard edge of poverty. Well, that's not an unfortunate juxtaposition. There's a dynamic causality between those. Wealth creates poverty. When the pharaoh can only get this tremendous amount of wealth and these great pyramids and all that, only when he's got half the population in slavery and they're living in misery and poverty. If much of the world's population is poor today, it's not because people suffer from underdevelopment. It's because they suffer from overexploitation. That's why I'm using the term, kind of an anachronistic old term, third world. It's the only term I can think of. I will not use the developing world. Everybody calls them the developing nations. They're talking about Haiti. They're talking about Nigeria. They're talking about countries that are where poverty is spreading at a faster rate than the population. The number of people living in poverty is growing at a faster rate than the population itself. So poverty is spreading as wealth accumulates. And it's not because they're not developing really. They're suffering from over-exploitation. And over-exploitation results in underdevelopment. And these are things you have to keep clarifying because the idiom really always goes the other way. It always goes to blur those kind of things. I mean, it sounds really great. I mean, the United Nations talks about developing nations. U.S. leaders talk about developing nations. The Communist Party talks about developing nations. They're not developing or underdeveloped, and they need to. Underdeveloped was considered something of an insult. And so they call them now developing. They're developing in that distorted way that comes with corporate capitalist investment in what's called free trade. Monopoly control. Empires always strive for monopoly control. Such control comes with direct colonization. When India belonged to the British Empire, there's nobody the Brits had to compete with. The empire set the conditions of investment, the conditions of marketing and sales. As the colonizers grow richer and richer, the per capita income of native populations sinks to lower and lower levels. Along with bringing commodities and resources to market, the monopolists will actually keep them off the market when it suits their so doing. We saw that in 1991, and that's what got Saddam Hussein in trouble. You remember, in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was Washington's poster boy. He was killing and murdering every constitutionalist, every Democrat, every socialist, every communist, every whatever. Even wiped out the whole left wing of his own Ba'athist party. And they couldn't think enough of him. Then he started making certain mistakes. Suddenly, Saddam Hussein, who they all loved, suddenly he started committing economic nationalism. That is, he wouldn't give the oil companies back to the British and American oil companies. I mean, the oil fields, he wouldn't give them back to the oil companies. He kept the whole economy nationalized. I remember Rumsfeld saying, it's a Stalinist economy. I was amused by the choice of terms there. Stalinist. What he meant was it was the states still owned us all. And he was asking for a bigger cut of the oil quotas, just the opposite of what we were being told. we were being told that Saddam Hussein, that mean bad guy, if he gets his way, we'll have no oil. He'll deprive us of his oil. We won't have oil, gas for our cars, we won't have oil to heat our houses and the like. It was quite the opposite. He was asking for a bigger chunk of the oil quota to sell his oil, and George Herbert Walker Bush and that gang were saying, no, we're worried. Too much oil on the market is going to do what to the oil prices? Down. That's what they're afraid of. Most of us are afraid of inflation. They're afraid of deflation. That's, to this day, they're still afraid of deflation. Because when prices go down, their profits go down. And what passes for free trade, I won't discuss free trade too much. I'll stop with one sentence right here. Free trade really is the way of undermining local production and self-development, the removal of protections and regulations that would foster local production. Now, the costs of imperialism, the costs of empire, empires are very costly affairs. The costs are not paid, the costs of imperialism are not paid by the imperialists. They're paid by the victims. The imperialists impose all sorts of taxes and duties upon subdued populations. So the people discover that the North American, in the case of Africa would be the Europeans and such, came down. They not only stole our land, they also are stealing our labor. We have to work in order to pay certain head taxes, and if we don't pay those taxes, we end up in jail. Empires are costly undertakings. They need naval fleets, they need bases, they need armies, they need gendarmerie. All these things have to be financed. Public leaders, officials and bureaucrats have to be paid and bribed. Another group of people who pay for empires are the people of the imperial country itself. I'm looking at them right now. All of you, you're looking at one of them too. But we pay our taxes, and that is much of that goes to pay for the empire. Upwards of $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion it comes to, say about 800 billion in the military budget, and then there's another close to 100 billion or more in the veterans. That's part of the past expenses. And then there's the money in the Department of Energy. Much of that research and such is for the military, and then money for all those bases. And then there's the additional allotments for actual specific wars that over and above the yearly amount you pay the Pentagon. Then a new war comes up, you got to have a new allotment for that. So it's an enormous amount of money that the U.S. taxpayers have to pay. And from this, you see, we have to protect ourselves from the people who write books about this subject. Except me, of course, I'm giving you the legitimate thing. But they always, I mean, their numbers, I mean, from Chalmers Johnson right on across, I'll mention one too. They always talk about the irrationality of our policies, the stupidities. Why do we get ourselves involved in this? We have $6 billion worth of investment in the Philippines, and it's cost us $9 billion in bases for and for running things and paying for things for our military control of the Philippines. So that's ridiculous. Empires are irrational. We're paying $9 billion to protect a $6 billion investment. That's ridiculous. That's not ridiculous. You're ridiculous. You're ridiculous when you think that the people who own and control the world are not as smart as you. And when you call them stupid, you're being stupid if you do. It's nothing. They don't mind that they pay $9 billion to protect $6 billion, because the $6 billion is theirs, and the $9 billion comes from you. And so they want to protect $1 billion. They'll spend if they want to spend, to protect $1 of theirs, they'll spend $2 of yours, 3, 4, 5. In fact, when it comes to protecting their money, your money is no object. I mean, they'll spend it as much as they can. And so, and yet we have all these writers, I mean, there's whole bunches of them, saying that about Central America. Someone like Saul Landau said that about Central America, that what it costs to prop up these governments in Central America and these military machines and this and that, is cost more than U.S. investments in Central America. I mean, but the people who pay the cost are a different group. They're called the, have a recent name, right? 99%. And the people who have the investments, they're called the 1%. So again and again, I don't know, it's a very simple idea. It means that the fundamental unit of analysis is not the nation, it's not only the nation, it's class. It's the class interest within both nations, both in Guatemala, Honduras, and in the U.S. There are people in Guatemala and Honduras who resist this U.S. intrusion and presence, but there are people in Guatemala and Honduras who love this and welcome them in and who feed off it. And those are the satellite leaders of these countries. The guy who sits there and says, come on in, amigos, come on in, it's all yours. The land, the resources, the markets, the labor. These guys try to unionize, we'll beat them up. We have our Guardia Civil, we take care of them. You just pay me off, take care of me, take care of my brother Jose, take care of my brother, or take care of my brother Muhammad Abdul, depending what country, if it's in the Middle East now, you know, the same thing. You have leaders who leave the thing wide open for the imperialist interests. So these ventures are not irrational. Timothy Parsons just wrote a book a year ago, The Rule of Empire. There's so many of these guys, you know, I mean, and they're well-intended, but they're just sort of wrong. He says, past empires produced extractive surplus that exceeded the costs of conquest and governance. And that was true. The Romans did calculate. They went into gold. Caesar went into gold because he knew he could get a lot. He could get a lot in wealth, in resources, in materials, and in slaves. He didn't go into Germania because it was just too difficult, too far, and too poor, and too cold, and he wasn't interested. And so it's very rational doing that way. But today, Parsons goes on, nowadays, conquest and governance exceed gains. U.S. has spent several $1 trillion on Iraq and nothing to show for it except trillions of additional debt. From this, Parsons concludes that the policy is misdirected and irrational. And I've already given you my answer to that argument. It's that you're misdirected when you think that these guys don't know that. And the fact of the matter is they have made tremendous profits in Iraq. From 2003 right on, the word was the place to invest, the place to get in on big money and big profits is Iraq. And you ask Blackwater, ask a number of other corporations and companies, they did very well. The Pentagon itself, ask whoever ripped off the hundreds of billions of dollars that the Pentagon says it can't account for, right? They admitted that 1/3 of their budget they've been giving allocations in Iraq, they don't know where it went. I don't know. Money just slips, you know, just goes, you know. So let me just repeat that again. Those who pay the costs of empire are not the same as those who enjoy the gains. The people who pay the costs are the 99%, and the people who are gainfully employed by the empire are the 1%. Not employed, I mean, who run it. Now, what's happened is we've gone from imperialism to neo-imperialism. Or to say the same thing with different words, we've gone from colonialism to neo-colonialism. And that means, and the Americans were the ones who sort of did that in Latin America. Actually, Latin America went through both when you think about it. They were in traditional direct colonial control for 300 years, from the early 1500s to the early 1800s. the Kingdom of Spain and also Portugal owned Latin America. I mean, that was it. In the early 1800s, you had a remarkable set of revolutions and rebellions with remarkable leaders like Simon Bolivar and such. So Latin America became independent, a whole conglomerate of republics or constitutional monarchs or autocracies, military autocracies, a variety of them. But then, from the, say, mid-1800s to today, Latin America got drawn back in neo-colonialism. I mean, but this time it wasn't Spain or Portugal for the most part. There was some European money, you know, in Guyana there was British, Dutch, and who was French Guyana? Was it? Yeah, French. But I mean, that was a small little slits just above Brazil there. But for the most part, it was the Americans who came in. It's kind of interesting because the American ruling class, their passion from the 1840s, 50s, 60s, certainly by 1880, 90, where they acted it out, their passion was, you know what it was? China. They thought China was our destiny. 500 million customers was the word that was used back in the, even as late as the 1910s and 20s. 500 million customers. China, well, back when 500 million was a lot of people. We got to go, that's our destiny. That's what, and the whole, they had a thing called the large policy. McKinley had it. It was McKinley, large, L-A-R-G-E, meaning big. And it was run by Senator Lodge, L-O-D-G-E. It's two different words. Lodge and Teddy Roosevelt, and McKinley was in on it all the way, and Proctor and these other guys, which they didn't talk to anybody about. I mean, but it was there in their personal correspondence. I spent a year of my life in the National Archives and in the Library of Congress reading and documenting this stuff, and wrote the whole thing, got whole file cabinets full, and I never wrote the book, though. Strangely enough, I never wrote the book. I don't know why. But it was about how the Spanish-American War really happened. And McKinley said at the end of it, he said, well, in a few months we knocked out Spain and we became a world power. And after the Spanish-American War, every European country put in ambassadorships in the U.S. instead, took out the little ministries, you know, upgraded it and all that. And the U.S. came out with owning Puerto Rico, owning Cuba, owning Guam, and owning the Philippines, and spending the next 4 or 5 years in a bloody war that killed an estimated 200,000 Filipinos to destroy their independence and take direct imperial control, nothing neo, direct imperial control of the Philippines. Always thinking of, we're going to get to China. The U.S. engaged in the war against China. How many people know that? Good. I'm talking about the Boxer Rebellion. If you look at the archives, and I looked through the veterans' records, because I was looking for particular veterans who I think were connected to the sinking of the battleship Maine. That's another whole story. I'm not telling you it at all now. But what would be interesting is sometimes you would see wars that have been fought, for the veterans are going to get a benefit from it, and there would be the Boxer War. It was rated in the Department of War as the Boxer War. The U.S. was there fighting to get into China. There were two countries that were latecomers and who came in so big and so hard that they ended up doing what? Fighting each other. And that was Japan and the United States. They never really got in. It was the Brits, it was the Germans to some extent. In Indochina, it was the French totally dominating it. But they always thought, this went on into the 1920s, the Asia lobby with Senator Nolan of California, remember? Always looking, Hearst used to do this. Hearst would say, we're too involved with Europe and Europe. Let's look to China, And it ended up, the U.S. capital didn't go to China, it went to Latin America. But it was always neo-colonial, and it was never with, I shouldn't say never, it was quite often with armies, but the armies were mostly in Central America and in the Caribbean. So, I'm rambling here, I'm sort of kind of, are you following me okay, it's all right? B plus at least, okay? No. What I'm trying trying to say is, another old-fashioned colonial land grab war, imperialist conquest war, which we shouldn't forget, because it's many of its ancestors. Oh no, I thought I was in California for a minute. No, I'm in Ohio. No, that's different. Okay, but Latin Americans were in California. When you ask somebody who's Latino, it's almost always Mexican, and they know, they don't need a reminder. But you're sitting in Mexico when you're in California. I mean, in as you all know, 1848, Mexico had more than half of its territory in a war of conquest taken from the United States. If you count Texas also, which was taken by incursions before that time. Texas and Nevada, no, Texas, yeah, Nevada, Arizona, a little western sliver of Colorado, and all of California, that was all Mexican territory, and that was all taken by the United States. So the old-fashioned bloody intervention. The U.S. also intervened with troops in Russia. Does anybody, you know, a lot of students, most Americans are shocked, didn't know that, that the U.S. had actually invaded Russia with 14 other capitalist countries after the Bolshevik Revolution to overthrow the Bolshevik government. And the testimonials that they had, the things they said about the Bolsheviks: don't respect private property, they don't believe in profits, they will give the common man the worst sort of ideas as to what's going on. I can show you Secretary of State Lansing's correspondence with President Woodrow Wilson, who sent the troops in. So places like this, the President of the United States, the first one to go to China, Communist China, I think, didn't know this. He didn't know about the Boxer War. And his name was, you might remember him, Richard Nixon, who, remember, he got up at the banquet and he said, the United States has never attacked or had an act of aggression against China, and China has never had any act of aggressions against the United States. We have always been friends. And I'm going, oh, Boxer, Boxer. Boxer. It should be good to ring right now. That would have been great, but it didn't. But, so, and dozens of other countries. In just the last 2 decades, the U.S. has invaded Grenada. Sovereign countries that have never attacked anybody else or have never attacked the U.S. Grenada, Panama, come help me, I'm getting Nicaragua, well, indirectly, yeah. Somalia invasion, the bombings in Iran, the total destruction of Yugoslavia. Here was a whole social democracy that was destroyed in Europe, and you can go on. There's no other country that can claim this kind of record of aggression that's happened now, this kind of thing. Now, again, I want to say that these wars are not power for power's sake. That's Chalmers Johnson. He's the one who's led that, and there's a whole flock of books on that Americans are just power crazy, or these policymakers are overweening, they're arrogant, they're inept, they're misdirected, or that their ultimate goal is just to be able to control everything. They don't want to control everything. In fact, they don't, as I say, with neo-imperialism, sometimes they didn't choose neo-imperialism. They got pushed out, as in Latin America and as in Africa after World War II. But when they got out, they still got what they want. The merchant, de Tocqueville said this, he said, the merchant doesn't want to own your land, he just wants your wealth. They don't want the headaches of ruling you and all that. When the U.S. went into Cuba, it was the same thing. They turned to the Cubans and they said, you know, we stole you fair and square from the Spaniards. And we own you, but it doesn't look good that in America a republic should own you, and it looks like there's going to be trouble and headaches. So we're going to give you your independence. You get your own flag. It's going to be red, white, and blue, with only one star on it because you're just a little island, you know, just a little island. And you have your own currency. You don't have to put George Washington on it. You can use Jose Marti. We're flex. And Spanish can be your official language. We won't try to shove English down your throats and all that. And all you do in return, all we ask is that we control your sugar plantations, the production and the sale of it. We control your tobacco plantations, your nickel refineries, your tourist trade. In other words, everything of great wealth in Cuba, we'll own it. So you get the shell of independence, and we get the substance, the wealth. And that's all they want. They're not Colonel Blimp imperialists. They're not the ones who glory and go down with the swagger stick and say, we're jolly fellows and we want to rule these bloody fuzzy wuzzies and keep them in line and hail Britannia and God bless the Queen and all that stuff. They didn't do that stuff. These were more men. These were capitalists. They're rational people. They run by a rational rule, which is cui bono, who benefits? What do I get out of this? Who do I get to pay for it? How do I get the gain? How do I get to live off other populations and the like? Another thing is they didn't do this because they're racist. Imperialism is not about racism directly, originally. Racism becomes handy, and you can use it, but they don't get and spend huge sums of money on armies and fleets and go to some country just to beat them up because they're dark. Let's go beat up some dark-skinned people and all that. They don't care. They'll fight anybody. They bombed Yugoslavia, as I said, it was as a white population in Europe. Who thought there was going to be a major war? The President of the United States, Bill Clinton, bombing it and breaking that social democracy up into a cluster of right-wing mini republics where everything has been deregulated and everything has been privatized and everybody's poor and everybody's white in that country. They don't care. The first imperialism of Western Europe was against Eastern Europe. Everybody was white. The oldest imperialism that the British Crown ever perpetrated, and one of the bloodiest, was against a very fair-skinned people called Ireland. They still got a piece of Ireland. So as I say, they don't. Now, when I come in and I burn your villages and I rape your women and I bayonet your men and I break down your little mines, little mining things that you've got, your domestic industry, and I shatter and destroy it and I kill your babies, now I have to justify that. And then I say, well, they're not really people. They're not like us. They're savages. And that's what happened when we stole all the land from the Indian nations, the Native American nations. And you have to justify it. And you stop. And that goes back to Governor Winthrop, who was in Massachusetts, the Plymouth Colony and such. They talked about the Indians. The first thing they did when they got here and landed was they praised God, and then they went into real estate. And that meant killing Indians. And when you kill Indians, you say they're infestation. They're devils. They're not humans. They don't have souls like us. And let's just kill them. You kill them and you take their land. So racism does very soon after you take the country. If you can use racism, if they're not whites, you come in and you say they're savages. There are quotes by Churchill who says this about Afghanistan. I think it was Afghanis, I forget now, years ago. Kaiser Wilhelm said it about Africans. I mean, I'm not going to repeat it, just utter racist comments made. King Leopold about the Congo and such. These people are subhuman. I was waiting for that. Boss, I was waiting for it. These people are savages, and it's murderous devils. They're not. Devil was a very common word used by the American religious leaders in the early colonial days about Native Americans, First Nation people here. Okay, and so you demonize the people you're going to victimize. That's happening today all the time. Syria is up, as you know. Syria is on the block there, and it'll probably be getting some humanitarian bombing from NATO soon. Because I heard this State Department woman, I think she's connected to something with NATO, and she's saying, well, the Syrians are torturing. They are gathering children together, and the Syrian army is torturing hundreds and hundreds of little children, just torturing them. And even the mainstream media announced it. That was a little too much even for him. He said, do you have any evidence of this? Did you see this happening? She said, no, but I've heard about it, and it's happening. So you know, when they start talking about how they're torturing and they're killing and raping everybody, that they're going to get bombed. They're going to get humanitarian bombs to kill them and their friends. Let me just, the consistent motive behind imperialism, I want to repeat it again and again, is material gain. How can you tell it's material gain? You just look at the pattern of intervention. Any country, any leader or movement, democratic or autocratic, however he got into power, that attempts to use its land, labor, natural resources, and markets for its own development and for its own advantage is targeted as an enemy. Any country, leader, or movement, whether democratically elected or dictator or autocratic or CIA put in with CIA assassinations like Saddam Hussein, that opens its land, labor, natural resources, and markets for imperial exploitation is treated as a friend. And Saddam Hussein is the interesting case I just mentioned before, because there's one man. You don't have to. You control him for the individual and the country and everything else. And at one period when he's acting this way, he's our ally, our friend, and all that. The minute he starts acting this way and refuses to continue to do this, he's a threat to the region. He's worse than Hitler. He's someone we have to deal with. We've got to stop him. And so that's the way it went. And that's, I rest my case right there. Every single time you'll find that's what it is. It doesn't matter if they're elected or not elected. It doesn't matter if they can be accused of this or that. It's what they're doing with their country. And there is also, and I would end it here with just a quick rundown. There's the methods of imperialism that ought to be looked at. Those methods go from murderous to soft. There is a term called soft imperialism. In fact, Hillary Clinton has kind of expropriated the term for the U.S. State Department. She calls it soft power. Isn't it? We're using power in soft ways. But let's look at the murderous stuff. The supreme authority of violence is relied upon in almost every area. The first thing they do is build up the armies. First thing they do is build up the security police. A superiority of firepower, striking power, communication, detection, an unmatched technology of destruction and domination. And this is something that's often overlooked in the discussions, even in whole books written on empire. Empires kill an awful lot of people, lots and lots and lots of people. Hundreds of, right now, you can go on. Assassination is not random, it's selective. Death squad assassinations all through Latin America focused on peasant leaders, labor leaders, student leaders. That's true in Africa also. In Colombia, we know literally several thousand labor activists have been killed. And Colombia is Obama's favorite little country, it seems. Total extermination of hundreds of villages and hundreds of thousands of people, as in Guatemala, El Salvador, by troops that are trained, financed, equipped by the United States National Security State. Destroy the base of insurgency so you destroy the populations. Dry up the water that the fish swims in. The Phoenix program in Vietnam pursued the systematic assassination of South Vietnamese liberation organizers and such. They weren't all even armed, many of them. Agent Orange, depleted uranium used in Indochina, used in Yugoslavia, used in Iraq and such to cause terrible damage to people and future generations. How do you pronounce Jaime? Jaime, J-A-I-M-E, Jaime. Jaime Roldos, who had been, as you know, president of Ecuador, who took on the oil cartels, who was initiating all sorts of reforms. His helicopter was exploded and he was killed. He had two helicopters, always had two, a decoy one and his. And one day, a well-planted, I guess, subordinates convinced him to use the decoy helicopter, and he was killed. Omar Torrijos of Panama, at his funeral, talked with admiration about his dedication to social change and democracy, and also mentioned to people that he himself was having horrible dreams about falling from the sky and a boy, that his own plane would be blown up, that he was going to meet the same fate as Roldos, and he did the very same month, 1981, after Ronald Reagan came into office, filled with hatred for Torrijos for making a claim on Panama and the canal and so forth and so on. And he was 2 months after Roldos, his plane exploded in midair. The false reports were that it just went down and hit some tree tops. No, it exploded right in midair. All the eyewitnesses. Planes don't just explode in midair, usually. Displaced by force and violence, President Aristide of Haiti twice, or is it 3 times? I lose count. President Zelaya just recently, as you know, 2 years ago in Honduras, his big crime was to want to lift the minimum wage of Honduran workers, and the Honduran military came in and got rid of him, while the President of the United States just made apologies for it and saying, you know, it's a military coup is not a good thing. We don't approve of it, but at the same time, we don't approve of changing the Constitution. Zelaya called for a non-binding National Assembly to look at the Constitution. In fact, constitutions can be changed. That's their nature. We have provisions in our own Constitution to change it. But this was Obama talking, slippery, slimy, devoted imperialist that he is. He also said that, a lot of people on the left say we shouldn't interfere in Central America. Now they want us to interfere in Honduras. That seems to be hypocritical, he said. And I thought to myself, I'm not a hypocrite. I don't say we should never interfere. And in fact, the problem is we are interfering in Honduras. That military was trained, equipped, financed, and they cleared it with the U.S. before they went and kicked him out. Recent times show the strange cancer epidemic among Latin American leaders. Argentine President Nestor Kirchner, he died of colon cancer. People are wondering what's happening. It is said that they have devised a means of shooting a projectile which is 1/4 of an inch long and has the circumference of a hair. That's how thin it is, and it is infected with high uranium or something or other, and hit somebody, and the person. This is not me making it up. That was before a Senate committee. It was shown. They brought the gun in that the CIA had, which can shoot something that could cause a person to have the symptoms of a heart attack or could cause cancer in some way. And you don't feel it. You don't even feel it. President Lula da Silva of Brazil, cancer of the throat. Well, he smoked for 40 years, so that we won't. But Brazil President, his successor, Dilma Rousseff, lymphoma in 2009. Cuba, 4 years ago, Fidel Castro, stomach cancer, and his brother took over. Bolivia, Evo Morales, nasal cancer, we think. I'm not sure. There's opinions saying he doesn't have cancer, but Paraguay's president, Fernando Lugo, former Bishop Lugo, who became a man for the people and became president, he has lymphoma and he's still undergoing treatment, cancer treatment. Venezuela, President Hugo Chavez has gone serious life-threatening cancers. he believes he's been targeted with cancer stuff. Argentine president, the successor to Nestor Kirchner is Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. Cristina has, since she became president, has developed thyroid cancer. What are the odds, what are the statistics involved here? The right-wing guys haven't had any cancer problems that we know of. I'm trying to think of one. Mubarak, he didn't have any cancer. George Bush, he didn't have any cancer. All right. And they don't go, their planes don't explode either, it seems to be. Okay. Then there's soft imperialism, and that includes capturing the targeted country's consumer markets and tastes, including dress styles, jeans, stoking a consumer mentality, fast foods. Remember the mania for McDonald's in Soviet Russia, the former Soviet Union too. Hollywood movies and television dramas in which everyone appears to be impressively affluent. I met a guy in Cuba one time who said to me, "Oh, I know you Americans who are rich. I saw it in Dynasty." Remember? And some of you are old enough to remember Dynasty. It was a what's that called? Series on TV. It was about these rich Texas oilmen, I think, and Dynasty. I said, yeah, that's right. I'll tell that to my butler when I get back. The worst was I remember the Moscow intellectuals. You would meet those guys. I met a guy in Moscow once. Small apartment he had. It was small, but a whole wall full of books. He had free education at Moscow University. He now spoke perfect English, near perfect and all that. Never missed a meal in his life. And he said, with total conviction, he said, "The poorest people in your country live better than I do." I said, man, we have people living in doorways and digging out of garbage cans, And you know what they said, these intellectuals? They said, "That's all right, you don't have to lie to us anymore." They knew that wasn't it. They knew that in America, everything was so right and so good and so perfect. All through Eastern Europe now, you see, Richard Pipes, he did this survey, multinational survey. And this guy's a right-winger, Pipes. You remember him from Harvard University. I'll give him credit that he published it. He didn't bury it. That survey, I cited it in one of my books, I forget what. That survey showed every country, every Eastern European country, including Russia, the overwhelming pluralities or majorities were it was better under the communists. I think that's hilarious that they were saying these things. And in Poland, Lech Wałęsa, I thought he said it all. He said to the Polish people, keep complaining, "This is awful. It was better under the communists." At least under the communists, my kid could go to school and university. Rents were affordable. We had enough to eat. We complained about shortages, but nobody went hungry. Blah blah blah. And Lech Wałęsa said it was very good. He said, "Hey, you wanted America? You're getting America." Well, where are you getting America? You're really getting it. So news and entertainment media, Hollywood films, I mentioned all that. I'll stop here. Religious fundamentalism, very strong in Central America right now, replacing the liberation theology churches, and of course the destruction of liberation theology and the implanting of right-wing bishops all through Latin America. Rock music groups, superstars captivating a nation's youth. The youth of all nations dream only of being rock stars at times, it seems. Education programs and textbooks are rewritten to promote the ideas of Western imperialism and such. Educating privileged elites. Do you notice in a number of these countries when a leader comes in, he's from Harvard, he's been at Harvard, educated, so-and-so. In Syria we'll get one, we'll get them. In Libya there's a couple of them. Harvard guys. They're Libyans, but they happen to spend a lot of time at Harvard. Okay. Are they trying to tell me something here? Well, there goes the Q&A. I'm going to end it right there. That was good timing. But you see how they've got us, don't you? Let me just end by saying that it's not wealth for, it's not power for power's sake. The power is used to get wealth, and you use your wealth to increase your power, to secure your wealth, and the like. Well, I guess it's staying on, good. Okay.
Can you repeat that?
Power, it's not power for power's sake, it's power being used to gather wealth, to protect markets, to gain resources, to have cheap labor, to do all the irrational things that a capitalist system needs when it goes international. You need to do that nationally and internationally. And if you understand that, then you understand more than if you know everything else, but you don't understand that. That's the important thing. And when you understand that, that means you move from a liberal complaint to a radical analysis. You move from a complaint about how inept your leaders are, how stupid, how overweening they are, how well-intentioned but confused they are. They're just not as smart as you. And you move from that kind of complaint to a radical analysis in which you see they are doing all sorts of things to keep the world in place and to keep history from happening and to keep people from developing and improving their own lives and such. Their fear, they don't want you improved. They don't want you to be literate and with a sense of self-entitlement, a high sense of self-entitlement, with a high level of expectation and such. That's not what they want. They want you hungry and desperate. The hungrier and desperate, the more weak they can get you, the harder they can get you to work for less and less. In 1900, as I said, we also worked for 12 cents an hour. And that's their goal, to get us back to 1900. That's a counterinsurgency that they waged. They waged it not only in El Salvador, not only in Guatemala, not only in Colombia, they waged it right here in Ohio, having to use different methods of time and the like. So that's the battle. The empire, in a sense, is in a sense under it is fighting. It always has to violence, arms, propaganda, deception, political intolerance, and the like to keep themselves up there in office. Because if the people really found out who was representing their interests and what their real interests were, they would turn on this. Instead, the people are misled by messianic imagery about America is the most pure, this is the greatest country in the world, we help other people and we just here and we save them. That's one theme, which doesn't often sell that well with Americans. They really don't want to go into Kuwait and rescue everybody there. They really would like to be able to pay their own rent and pay more attention to that. But the other theme is terror and fear, to play on fear, to say there are enemies at the gate, these enemies are out to get you, and the enemies, in my generation, my life, it was the communists everywhere, communists in the schools, communists in Hollywood, communists in here, communists there, communists under your bed, communists going to get your mama, you know. I made up that last one, nobody else. And then it was the drug war. The drug wars all over the place. We got to go here. We got to go to this country. We bombed whole countries, right? We destroyed and attacked and invaded Panama over supposedly drug wars. And the irony, of course, is these drug cartels were all embedded with the CIA. The military and government leaders were in on the drug trade through much of Latin America. So then there's the drug war, and now there's the terrorism, the global terrorism. These terrorists, they're all out to get us. And in fact, American forces, American presence is hated in many of these countries, not for some reason that they're just jealous of us and we're so prosperous and they're so poor. It's hated because the ruling interests have their boot on the necks of these people, and that's what they hate. Don't ask me, ask Osama bin Laden. That's what he said again and again. He said, we are not in an aggression against America. We just want you to leave us alone. If you left us alone, we will leave you alone. If you got rid of the war that you create on our heads, we would not try to bring the war to your soil at all. Nobody ever gave that much play in the mainstream media as to what he was saying. They were too busy celebrating his murder. So, I'll end it right there and tell you, remember now, always a radical analysis rather than a liberal complaint. Thank you very much. I went much too long, didn't I? About an hour of that went, wow, you guys were very patient. That was nice. Yes. You want to do Q&A? Do you really want to? I mean, pay isn't that good. I don't know. Okay, yeah, we'll do Q&A. A few questions, just a few questions. See, I see hands go up, and they're always les hombres. Now, let's have some. I'm going to take one man, one woman, one man, one woman. Okay. You're numero uno, and senora over there, too. Okay, go ahead.
It occurs to me there are two unique examples that you didn't touch on.
There's a lot of things that you go ahead.
One you almost did, which was the Platt Amendment in Cuba, as compared to Paul Bremer's 100 Rules for
right.
Iraq.
That was the other condition on Cuba. You have your flag and this and that, and we have all the sugar and we also control all your relations with third nations, right? We'll control your foreign policy, right?
And then the other was Israel, as if you see that as a military and policy outpost of U.S. policy interests. You mentioned the example of racism being employed to dehumanize various populations that are targeted by neocolonialism. Some of that same rhetoric has been employed by the founders and the current leaders of Israel.
What's your position on Israel in the sense of, do you think Israeli policy is the sub-imperialism of the U.S.? Or do you think, there's some very good people on the left who are split on this sort of thing. Jim Petrus, for instance, James Petrus, has written some excellent articles and books, and some of the Zionists really want to strangle him. But his view is that Israel, at least in that area of the Middle East, dictates policy to the U.S. That they have AIPAC has such an influence not only in Congress but in the executive branch and the media, everywhere else, that in fact Israel is calling the shots. They quote, what was his name? Israeli leader, the fat one. Sharon. That's terrible. My memory's going, but at least I can still mime my way through a lecture if I have an intelligent audience. Thank you so much. Thank you. Poor old guy needs all the help he can get. Sharon once said, "We tell the Americans what to do." At least he was quoted as having said that. There's that view, and Jim Petrus has that view. There's other view. My son Christian Parenti says, "Nah." He says, if ever, and I've said that too, if ever the U.S. interests were at variance with Israel's, the U.S. would dump Israel like they'd dump anybody else, any imperialist country would do. And I'm not so sure how, I can't make up my mind, because I don't know how you can even conceptualize that. Do you know what I mean? That is, for instance, what is it you have to make that second position non-falsifiable? You have to imagine a condition that could arise where that would happen. You see, otherwise it's not a scientific proposition that you can test. And I can't think of any, because I think of the Liberty. Remember that? The Liberty was during the Six-Day War, where an American reconnaissance ship came right into the waters, and what did the Israelis do? They bombed it for like 12 hours and killed about 70, and shot down 3 American flags that the guys kept putting up. And what did Lyndon Johnson do? He hushed it up. And they had called, and there was a U.S. fleet, and these planes were coming to go, mano a mano with the Israelis, and they would have wiped out the Israeli force. But they were called back. And so these guys were killed and murdered, and this is an American ship. And the survivors were brought back, and they were instructed, never talk about what happened today. Never once talk about it. Well then, what is it that Israel would possibly do that the U.S. would then, assert a countermeasure? I don't know. So it's hard to fit Israel into this because it's an imperialist nation in a very limited way. It's taking over Palestine, taking Palestine over. Did I say anything that?
It's illuminating, I just
Yeah.
wondered your position.
Yeah. Yes.
So what's your take on American intervention in the Arab Spring, given that their support of the military in a number of countries, specifically Egypt, continues? 30%, I think, if not more, of the Egyptian military budget is.
Well, but that's correct. That's correct policy, isn't it? I mean, they don't want change in Egypt. Obama doesn't want change. He was with Mubarak right until he couldn't hold him anymore. Like Ronald Reagan with Marcos in the Philippines, remember? He was the last guy in all of Washington, D.C. He said, he's been doing all right. He won an election. He's a nice fellow. Even the CIA said, look, Marcos has got to go. There's a certain point in neo-imperialism where when your comprador leader is going to become so corrupt, so repressive, so inhumane, so rotten in every way, that he's a liability. He becomes a liability, you know. And they were saying to Reagan, we got to get rid of Marcos. We've got like 80, 90, 100,000 Filipinos out on the streets. We got nuns standing in front of tanks with rosary beads, and the guys in the tanks were stopping and opening up. And he said, this thing is going to really crumble. We've got to get rid of Marcos and do what? Put another Marcos in, but put a different face, different name, you know, and he'll do a little powder puff, a little cosmetic change here. Yeah. And that was Mubarak. Obama never had a single negative word to say about Mubarak. And talked about Gaddafi as the worst. And the difference between Gaddafi and Mubarak is Mubarak welcomed in the IMF. Mubarak welcomed in the American capital, and Gaddafi would not allow the IMF in, would not allow American capital, and kicked out the oil companies and did a whole bunch of other things like, oh, am I walking away too far? Are you losing your sound? Okay. Well, so did I answer your question? So what did they do? They did the same thing with Marcos. Finally, when they had to get rid of Mubarak, they backed, and when I say they, I mean Barack and Hillary, they backed the security chief, the guy who had more blood on his hands than Mubarak. Well, make him, we're changing the government, okay? Well, the Egyptians were saying, well, wait a minute, that is not what we want. It's very interesting what the Egyptian protesters were saying. For you anarchists in the audience, they were saying, we need leaders. That is, you need a vanguard, you need an organization. There's so much you can do spontaneously, massively, but you need people making decisions, even, I mean, making them democratically, you know, canvassing the rank and file and all that sort of thing. But it just doesn't happen. It's beautiful when certain things do happen spontaneously and all that, but after a certain point, you have to direct your energies and such. And the Egyptian spring is really not much of a spring. I don't see. It's going to. It seems to like the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be taking over. Is that? Would people agree with that in Egypt?
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
But see, they have organization. They do. Okay. All right. We'll have a. Oh, I think your hand was up before. Was it? Was it up before?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Thank you. My question is, now, this is my impression. It seems to me like things have changed since the fall of the Soviet Union, since communism no longer became a threat. I worked in corporate environments before, and it seemed to me like before that, corporations exercised a certain self-restraint. There was corporate responsibility and social responsibility. Now, I don't know if that, a lot of that was window dressing, but is your impression, now it seems like capitalism is turning on itself. I don't remember that. I mean,
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely.
it's now turning on itself.
It was called the Great Compromise. It was called, all of Western Europe after World War II became social democracies. We're going to give you workers' benefits. You're going to have health care, free health care. You're going to get this, you get that. That was because of well-organized communist parties, but also because they were in the shadow of Eastern Europe, where the workers were getting those very things in Eastern Europe. And if it wasn't for that, they would have never done it in Western Europe, and the same in the US. We started giving things to workers and better pay and this and that, get the communists out of your unions and all that, which they did. It was, if it wasn't for, and once the communists were done in, there was terrible angry comments made by people like William Buckley and right-wingers here saying, they're rolling back and getting a free market in Eastern Europe. Why don't we have a free market here? Why do we still have to put up with Medicare and Social Security and all these kinds of things and pensions and whatever else? Let your family take care of you in your old age. They were, most definitely were saying, isn't it time to get back to 1900? That's absolutely true. They no longer had to buy off their working class to some degree, as they had to do. Western German working class had to be bought off. Look what they were getting in Eastern Germany. Yes, Ms. Hurtham was up next.
Enlighten the 99% so that they know what's really going on and what can they do about it.
If what? The 99?
If the 99% gets enlightened and really realizes what's going on, what can they do about it?
So I think your question is consciousness enough? Of course not. Consciousness leads to other actions. If 99% did that, they wouldn't be volunteering for the army. The empire's Achilles heel is in the army. That's why Obama loves drones. Drones, that's their dream. Their dream is to have a totally mechanized force that has no people in it, because Americans start getting annoyed when their sons and daughters come home in caskets even with nice American flags over it. It's still an unpopular thing. So if you can get a military, or rather, if you can, I've said that's one of the Achilles heel. People would not be joining the military. People would not be working in military technology and building all sorts of terrible things. People would not be serving rotten interests in the State Department and the like. That's the answer. You'd have different kinds of people on your courts and the like. Yes, you're next. And then this lady there. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier on the efforts of some in Latin America to change their constitution. They were kicked out or killed. You don't do that. But isn't that the answer in this country, where our constitution today has been rewritten so that corporations are people and are able to get into government?
You mean reinterpreted, not rewritten. Reinterpreted.
Reinterpreted, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
There's no new language was put in on that one.
Not in the Constitution,
Right.
but in the courts, reinterpreted by the courts to give them the power to do what they do today, which is to write our laws, to control government.
Conservative judicial activism. I have an article called Conservative Judicial Activism on my website, which is www.michaelparenti.org. On the website, there's articles, if you go down, and I talk, because they always talk about liberal judicial activism, whereas we conservatives respect the Constitution and we're strict constructions. It's not true. It's amazing the kind of things they're coming up with and writing. Yeah.
Anything I find that the conservatives say is what they accuse the liberals of doing is actually what they're doing.
Right. It's a very common thing.
But I don't want to drop that point of corporate personhood. I believe in this is why it's movement around the country today to amend the Constitution to state that corporations are not persons who do not have access to constitutional rights, and that money is not speech, which is the other side.
Right.
Which would eliminate
The money speech one is, there are two acts of magic alchemy that the Supreme Court committed. It's called activism, but I call it alchemy, you know. They changed corporations into people, and they changed money into speech. As Justice Stevens said in a dissenting opinion, he said, money is not speech, money is property. Does that come as a surprise to anybody? But, so that's what they're doing, yeah. So what's your point?
You said the answer is for people not to work here or not to do this or not to that. I'm saying that the answer is to do just what we have done a number of times in the past, and that is to amend the Constitution so that corporations no longer have access to the Constitution in order to obtain what they need.
Right, but also wage a counter campaign against that point. I mean, amending the Constitution is a laborious thing. It doesn't happen easy. You know, it took 60 years to get the women's vote into the Constitution by the amendment process, and all those things. Yeah, I mean, that's a battle. Yeah, that's one of the battles we have to fight, I guess. Yes, yes, Miss.
Okay, so if I'm looking at ecology at the same time I'm looking at political economy, I'm concerned that when we have an image of we are the 99% and we are in the same group with the people who are pushed off their indigenous land, that actually our lives are part of the problem, that our lives and what we use and how we live in the world isn't possible for the whole world. That it makes the accountability only in this 1% and not in everyone who's taking part in the corporations and buying from the corporations. And I'm wondering how you would balance those realms of power.
It's a common comment I've heard again and again and again, that we're part of the problem because we live affluently, and there's nothing wrong with people living affluently if it's rationally, and a lot of it isn't rational. I mean, the whole transportation system, we're poisoning. Every time we get in a car, you ever think you're poisoning the very air that you're breathing. 1 gallon of gasoline uses up like, I don't know how many cubic feet of oxygen in the air, burns it out. It's astonishing, it's terrible. And now that China is going into cars, and Helen Caldicott said it's very right and very correct for the Chinese to have cars if they want them and such, but it's going to mean the end of the world. Well, she has a tendency to overstate, but it has affected the air quality in California because the stuff dumps right where I live, you know, and it's not the greatest thing. I have a lung condition now. I don't know what it's from. I suspect cars have something to do with it. Yes, but you see, we could live much more rationally and much more correctly. You know, get rid of the meat consumptions and all those kinds of things, and destroy Monsanto. We have to destroy Monsanto. When the new revolutionary government comes in and I'm made Minister of Interior, I will line up all the Monsanto guys and they will be put into prison just for a while until they're, no, never mind, we won't talk about it. But that's a different question. That's certainly true. And there are people in China who didn't need these cars. I've talked to Chinese, I know that they buy it because it's the craze, because they got to have a car. It's a status symbol. They don't even use it that much. So yeah, that's part of the problem, but that's not the problem, because that's in a capitalist economy that forces you and teaches you to consume and do certain things in certain ways when you can do them in more rational ways, you know, like recycling gray water or these sorts of, there's all sorts of things we could be doing where you get close to zero effect on the environment, you know, where it would be a lot better. Limiting population, we really need population control. China is the only country in the world in history that's actually tried to limit population growth by saying, you know, all Hans can have only 1 kid, Tibetans can have 3 kids, other minorities can have 2 kids, and that's that. Or if you're in an agrarian area and you have a daughter, you can have a 2nd kid. Because what they were finding is some of them were knocking off the daughter to have a tried for a son again. I mean, these are irrational, crazy, people have horrible, irrational, crazy ideas. I mean, there are Chinese who believe your family is not complete until you have a son. I know a woman who was the 9th daughter of a Chinese family. They had 10 daughters, and finally the 11th kid was a son. I said, is your mom stopping now? She said, oh, yes, she stopped now. But you had to have the son. I mean, they're crazy. I wrote a book on this called The Culture Struggle. We have places in Pakistan, all over Central Asia, Middle East and such, villages where if your daughter is raped, you kill your daughter. You don't go out and kill the rapist. I came from a Southern Italian background where you went after the rapist. You didn't. Your daughter was victimized by him. But But this, they say, no, your daughter is now dishonored, and your family is dishonored. And the only way to cure that is by killing your own daughter. I mean, it's insane. So we're facing the 99%, you can point out all sorts of maniacs and crazy things in there. That's not the issue here. That's not what we're talking about here, though. You can't start correcting a lot of that unless you get rid of this kind of scourge of accumulate, as they do now. That's what I would have to say to that. How about if we just take one more question, if there is? Okay, yeah.
Well, what you were talking about process-wise, it sounded like the third world is in Ohio now. And so I was wondering, do you see any connection between these processes to imperialize the United States and this the evolution of fracking? Because it seems like that's not a commercially viable process currently, so it has to be getting subsidies from somewhere. So do you see any connection between Ohio becoming a third world nation and fracking? And with the globalization of corporations, should we be thinking about ourselves as global citizens and globalizing labor? Two questions.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not so sure what the questions are. Yeah, there's been fracking in Ohio. I guess in Ohio. I know there's a lot in Pennsylvania. It's a horrible thing, but some people are making big bucks off it, and it's going to give them natural gas that they can then sell and make even bigger bucks. So it's something that should be stopped. What was the second question?
With the globalization of
Oh, labor, yeah.
should there be, do you think it would be fruitful for Americans to start thinking of themselves as global citizens and globalizing labor?
Yeah, well, the labor leadership in this country was so damn Cold War anti-communist, much of it, that they often were their own undoing, and they would complain of American jobs being exported to, say, Latin America, where the pay was, 1/10 what it is up here. And some of us were saying, well, if you're so worried about cheap labor in Latin America, we don't want to ratchet down the gains the American workers did to them. We want to lift up their gains, and therefore you should be showing some support for the labor union movement in Latin America. And a lot of these guys did not do that because they're so well planted. I don't know if it's CIA or who the hell it is, but they were so anti-communist that they wouldn't do those sort of things. It goes back to Samuel Gompers, it's like that. So to get people to see how, in fact, you're not competing, and it's the 1% of the rhetoric of this story saying, we're competing, American workers have got to get in there, you're competing against Chinese, and it's a very bad situation because about 1.5 billion more workers have been put on the market that weren't there before. And I'm thinking of all of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union and China and in India. There's an awful lot more competition. But instead of seeing them as your competitors, see them as your brothers and everybody working together rather than against each other, which is what the guys at the top want. They're very clever. I just saw an ad in the Wall Street Journal that said, think of this, I forget it was some bonds or this or that. Come on, become one part of the 1%. They've already co-opted it. They're not denying it anymore. Say, yeah, we're the 1%. Come on, ain't that hot? Come on, get in on it. All right, we'll get them. Don't worry, we're going to get those guys. Thank you.